It was just last year that I took my first ever trip into the town of Silent Hill when I played the original game with one of my best friends, Backpack Comics. I even reviewed the game for the channel, and I found that while the tank controls didn't really vibe well for me, I still found the overall artsy horror feel and the excellent atmosphere to be intriguing and well worth the playtime. I enjoyed getting to learn the deep lore of this first entry in such a legendary and beloved horror franchise, as well as finding some of my own meaning in the game itself. Then earlier this year, I played the free Silent Hill: The Last Message, and while I once again had some issues with the main character's model looking a bit rough, and some other things, overall I did enjoy the experience and I found myself becoming more and more interested in the Silent Hill franchise. So there we were, a few days before the start of October, and I had already finished the other two horror games that were on my list for this year to really buckle down and finish for October. Those reviews will be coming out shortly. But I was looking through my backlog list for some more horror games to play, and then I remembered that the remake for Silent Hill 2 was due to release in just a few days. I immediately began my trek into the town of Silent Hill once more, excited to play what many hail to be the greatest game in the franchise. Welcome back to the channel, Pooper Troops, and if you're new here, I'm your host Dylan, and welcome to Break the Backlog, the series where I share my thoughts, opinions, and personal stories about a particular game that I've been playing. Today's game is one that needs no introduction. We're going to be talking about one of the most highly revered horror games to ever be released, Silent Hill 2. I've had many friends in my life suggest this game to me, and I myself have seen just how passionate this fan base is for especially this game in particular. Everyone has so many opinions on what they think the meaning of the various things are in this game, and this title has been dissected over and over and over again, with people finding profound meaning in even the most minute of details. Now, I do plan on playing the remake of this game, and based on some early opinions from both those who received review copies and the two people over on Reddit who kind of blew up for getting their copies early due to what I can only assume was a shipping error, I am genuinely excited for this remake. My original script for this video did admittedly contain a bit of a rant, where I did talk about the fandom and how cringe and toxic and gatekeepy they can be, but to their credit, many have been able to throw up their hands now that we have a more in-depth look at what the game actually looks like, and they say that they are excited and happy to be proven wrong. Now, don't get me wrong, there's still a small vocal minority out there who refuse to put down their pitchforks at any cost in the name of a game that they've really allowed to become their only personality trait at this point, and yes, they can be annoying, just like in any fandom. And I have heard that some people are saying that the people that are now changing their minds are hypocritical, but I actually respect the people who are able to say that they feel like they were maybe too quick to judge and just should have waited until the game came out. And to be honest, based on both Bloober Team's history of making some lower budget horror games that really didn't hit the mark for most people, and Konami just completely cashing it in and not really being interested in making quality games, it seems like, anymore, I don't blame people for being cautious with this game. I'm more so talking about the fans who, if they were being honest with themselves, nothing really would have pleased them. Some people really just like to complain because it gives them a sense of belonging to something as they unite in their hatred of all the new voices, perspectives, players, anybody new involved in something that they highly revere. Needless to say, there are seemingly a lot of strong emotions around the release of this remake, and just like with any game as legendary as this, there's going to be the vocal group of gatekeepers standing at the ready to tell everyone that they hate the new Silent Hill fans because they would never get it. Because of this, I wanted to hop into the original release of Silent Hill 2 to see if the legends be true, or if I, a new fan of the series who's also looking forward to the remake, could indeed get it, whatever it is. So without further ado, let's take a trip to everyone's favorite vacation destination, Silent Hill, and find out what's going on with that little funk master James Sunderland and his tales of woe. Sit back, relax, and grab a snack as we break the backlog on the original Silent Hill 2. Team Silent wasted no time in their development of Silent Hill 2 back in 1999 after the previous title was completed and released in the same year. There was originally no plan for a sequel, as nobody could have predicted the heights that the first game would reach. So when talks began of how to approach a follow-up game to a game as successful as the first one, the team had decided to set out to create a sequel that would both expand and improve upon the foundations laid by the first game's wild success. The team had voiced some desire and excitement around this opportunity to create a game on the new hardware of gaming's 6th generation, as this power boost would let them develop a world and story that more realized the concepts that they had wanted to include in the original, but were unable to due to the limitations of the original PlayStation. The shelving of these ambitious ideas that could now be put into practicality became a driving force that helped this team come together with a distinct goal in mind. As well as improve upon the presentation of the game, Team Silent also wanted to craft a deeper narrative that played with abstract concepts in the human psyche. Because of this, they wanted every facet of the game to be a reflection of this direction for the sequel, and the team pored over paintings, films, books, and other video games in search of inspiration to stoke the fires of creativity. There was this sense amongst the team that they had to continue to push the limits of what the horror genre could be even further. With so much focus into honing their storytelling abilities, subtle and vague messaging throughout the game being a huge emphasis, and the power of the PlayStation 2, things were looking bright for Silent Hill's future. The team rallied around the idea of making a game that would haunt players and provide both visually and emotionally disturbing content, as well as a complex and twisting narrative that covered many ideas and abstract concepts. Staff members in charge of giving us the visual side of this goal included art director Masashi Sugiyama and the character designer Sato Takayoshi. Hey guys, it's Editing Ploop here, and I just realized that I almost forgot to add in Masahiro Ito to this video, which without him we wouldn't have the amazing monster designs, including the big bad pyramid head. So yeah, I didn't want to forget him, and I wanted to just add him real quick. I can't believe I almost forgot such a beautiful drawing man. Yeah, anyways, let's get back to the video. The environments done by Sugiyama were designed to intrigue the player to explore them while also doing their very best to be disgusting and grimy. Silent Hill was envisioned as the sinister place where people find themselves exploring a ghost town with dilapidated buildings, derelict corridors, and places that are just gross and claustrophobic. Luckily for the returning team members that had made the previous title, they had a really strong sense of how they wanted the world of Silent Hill to look. And so a lot of the world design was just more focused on building out from that vision that they had had for the original Silent Hill and using their new resources to make the world a bigger and better representation of that vision. The long streets covered in dense fog were carried over from the first game, as isolation is a big part of the Silent Hill experience. Tight spaces with enemies bearing down on the player were also included in the second entry, as areas like the hospital are like echoes from the cramped school hallways of the first title. There's also the Otherworld, a hellish rust-covered flip side of Silent Hill that takes real-world locations in the towns and turns them into a much more dark and terrifying place. The Otherworld also makes a return in Silent Hill 2 as well, with Otherworld versions of locations being in even more disrepair than they were before. Now, what is here features a lot of new ideas or reinterpretations of these past concepts as well. Part of this was imagining new monsters that would hunt down the player in the various places within the town, and these also had a great significance when looking at the main character James and his state of mind. While the first game's creatures would be manifestations of the fears and emotions conjured from the mind of someone who was not the main playable character, Silent Hill 2 took into consideration the complex feelings and emotions that would arise out of the pain and grief of watching someone that we love wither away due to illness. There's also this journey to Silent Hill that James makes in the beginning of the game. In Silent Hill 1, Harry already starts off within the eerie town and he sees his daughter in the distance. Silent Hill 2's approach was focused on unsettling the player by having them run through the mysterious and dense fog for quite some time before reaching the town proper. James himself is also a much different protagonist than Harry, just based on his reason for being in Silent Hill alone. Harry is driven by the search for his daughter, which we as the player and Harry himself sees throughout the game. Both he and we know that she is alive, so that parental instinct to protect her at all costs is the reason and driving force that sees him facing down all these terrifying creatures in order to get her back to safety. Now James, on the other hand, is going to Silent Hill to meet his wife, who has been dead for 3 years. A mysterious letter from supposedly Mary herself ends up asking James to meet her in Silent Hill at their special place, but even James seems to have a hard time believing this throughout the opening hours of the game. These design choices do make James feel like a much more depressing character to be on this journey with. Now, I don't want to talk too much more about the presentation or the narrative or the world, because we're going to cover that in the next section, but just know that these were massive focuses for the team. The gameplay foundations were kind of built, and as we'll get to talk about later, a lot of the gameplay is very similar to the first game, but it's the way in which it's used on the backdrop or the canvas of the narrative that just makes it have so much more oomph, I feel like. But yeah, we'll get there, I'm getting ahead of myself. As I said earlier, nailing the presentation of this title was one of the most important things to Team Silent. They wanted to find ways to make this game truly scary on multiple levels, using sound, music, and visuals in ways that would elevate the tense atmosphere that was established in the first game. I think they largely nailed that as far as expanding upon the previous game's vibes and concepts, and a lot of my reasoning on that comes from the fact that this game is really a lot more tense and scary than the original. As I said earlier, the fog felt far more dense, and with the upgraded visuals, it really came with the anxiety that I know eventually I'd probably happen upon something that I really didn't want to fight while I was fumbling around town for some sense of where to go next. The town itself also manages to feel larger while also more isolated, with it featuring these long streets shrouded in the mysterious mist that dresses the entire town. However, it's the interior areas of exploration that truly benefit from the upgrades and visuals, I feel, as the dark and often cramped quarters of these buildings do wonders for the building of tension and atmosphere. A lot of these derelict buildings are in disrepair and covered in rust, grime, and goo that just looks like an image I could smell. Like, even with the graphics of the time, listening and watching James slosh around in a toilet full of God knows what is just disgusting. He's a lot braver than I am. I also really like that most of the tense areas in the game were ones in which many of the doors were inaccessible, meaning it often became a mad dash to try every doorknob until I hit one that I could actually get into for a moment of rest while dodging the knives and kicks of the monsters chasing me. But it was also in the moments when I wasn't actually sure if I was safe or not that I found were some of the truly scariest moments. I found that Silent Hill 2 really toyed with my sense of comfort and safety during my first playthrough, with its brilliant use of sounds that often don't even come with any danger. Whether it's a blood-curdling scream that slices through the deafening silence of a room so dark I couldn't even see the walls around me, or the game playing sinister music after my first run-in with Pyramid Head, this game has so many well-placed audio scares that sometimes mean danger and other times just exist to send that shiver of terror down your spine. Oh, and the soundtrack, by the way, is absolutely phenomenal. Everything from somber guitar tracks to the industrial and metallic clangs and bangs of some of the game's more spooky ambient tracks are done with such a masterclass of quality that they easily reinforce that this narrative is both tragic and depressing at times, and extremely tense and scary at others. The fact that the soundtrack managed to provide both moments of tragic beauty as well as visceral, industrial sorts of songs to accompany the more tense moments throughout the game showed how versatile the composer Akira Yamaoka's work really was. So yeah, the audio was top tier and it offered just as much, if not more, than the visuals when it came to applying tension to certain parts of this playthrough. There were portions of this game that really did take a lot longer for me to finish just because of this, as I would play far more cautiously due to being afraid of what might be lurking in the darkness just beyond my scope of vision. And the things that do lurk in the darkness are another aspect of this game's presentation that reinforce the psychological horror elements that made this game so revolutionary and iconic. Many of the monsters that James encounters really hone in on that concept of the uncanny valley, or things that are so close to resembling a human but just off enough to be unsettling. Whether it's the mannequins or the nurses or even Pyramid himself, each features largely human features to their designs that are just tweaked enough or some weird element is added to them to make them scary. Mannequins are bits and pieces of multiple mannequins that have been cut and sewn together to make some that have no arms and crawl on the ground, and others who are two pairs of legs haphazardly sewn vertically together. The nurses have human bodies, but their faces are null of any expression or discernible human features. And all of these enemies move in inhuman ways, twitching, scurrying, and flailing about as they chase James throughout the areas of the game. The roars and screeches that they let out upon noticing James is present are anything but human, but can put a ton of tension into areas where the soundtrack is relatively quiet until James is discovered. Now, while there's only a few more different enemies other than the three I just listed, the ways in which these small number of enemies are used is pretty impactful as they're all designed rather well, with deeper narrative meanings in relation to our main character. Now, I don't want to talk too much about the narrative, especially because the remake is set to release so soon, and you really should just experience this game for the first time yourself, but some may notice that both the mannequins and nurses feature some overtly sexual themes, and this is by design. I just wanted to talk about these specifically to highlight how much thought and care went into making enemies that meant something deeper than just being scary for the sake of being scary. Both feature elements of femininity in their appearance, and this is done to reflect James's sexual desires that he experienced when his wife was sick and dying. The twisted, sinister, monstrous element to them, at least in my opinion, is a representation of the complex feelings of guilt or shame that he would have likely felt when having these suppressed sexual desires while his wife was battling and losing against an unknown progressive illness. And I thought that these touches and attentions to the smaller details was part of the reason that the presentation left such a positive impression on me. The sound design is brilliant, the enemy designs are interesting and scary in all the right ways, and the world did accomplish that feeling that the team had set out to create a balanced feeling of being afraid and repulsed by the environments, but also intriguing me in mysterious ways to make me want to explore and learn bits of lore about the characters and overall story that are hidden amongst these environments. Now, just something from my perspective that I don't think aged all that well about the game's presentation is the voice acting. Now, I have heard some opinions when researching this game that I could totally see being true about how the often stiff voice performances are coming from characters who are struggling with their mental health issues, or maybe the reason why they found themselves in Silent Hill. However, whether that's true or not aside, the awkward and often strangely delivered lines between characters did feel off-putting at times, and more in a funny cringe way than in a scary way.
I'm looking for someone.
Who is it?
Someone very important to me. I'd do anything if I could be with her again.
Me too. I'm looking for my mama. I mean my mother. It's been so long since I've seen her.
Many of these lines felt like they had really awkward senses of direction, and sometimes the timing of responses just felt really off. It wasn't the worst I've ever heard, and it was definitely a step up from some of the awkward voice lines of the same nature from the original game, but it was very noticeable when it happened, and regardless of intention, I still think that the execution matters. Now, with all that being said, not all the voice acting is like this, and most of it was serviceable at worst and good otherwise, but there were those moments that just made me kind of chuckle at how campy the actor sounded. All in all, the presentation was mostly excellent for the time it was released in, and while it may have aged in the last 23 years since it released, it has certainly still held up in most regards in my humble opinion. The lengths at which the team were willing to work to take a multifaceted approach to scaring their players and building yet another masterful atmosphere was felt in both the audio and visuals that included a beautiful and haunting arrangement of songs, brilliant sound design to bait the player's anxiety and terror, a world that did manage to be both intriguing and repulsive, and monsters that masterfully captured the meaning of the uncanny valley. I really loved the presentation of Silent Hill 2, and despite my issues with the voice performances, they never really hindered my experience. More so just provided a bit of a comic relief when they were really at their cringiest. Now, the gameplay of Silent Hill 2 is one of the things that is still very much in line with that of the first game. At its core, it's still very much a game about solving puzzles, fighting and avoiding monsters, and uncovering mysteries while exploring various areas of the town of Silent Hill. Before we do talk about gameplay a bit more, I just wanted to be transparent that I did choose to play on normal combat and normal riddle difficulty. Let's talk about the combat first. Now, I wouldn't say that fighting is your go-to method of engaging with enemies in Silent Hill 2, well, most enemies I should say. The average enemy can usually be avoided in the name of preserving resources, and this is by and large how most encounters will probably go, especially in more open areas where it's much easier to navigate and run around them. Now, that being said, there are quite a few areas within the game that feature narrow hallways and other tight spaces in which numerous enemies can happen upon the player and make running a much more difficult option to choose. In these situations, fighting may be unavoidable, so James does have access to different options he finds throughout his journey to do battle with these freaks. These weapons can be easily sorted into melee and firearm categories. The lightweight handgun allows James to fire while on the move, making it ideal for running and gunning down enemies who try to get too close. The rifle and shotgun, however, offer a ton more in ways of stopping power, but you can't move while you shoot with them, so there's a little bit of a trade-off there. The good news is, at least on the difficulty that I played on, enemies that you do choose to take down stay dead. That can make strategically clearing a troublesome room worthwhile, as this game does kind of feature a ton of backtracking within the dungeon-like buildings that you traverse and solve puzzles inside of. As far as the actual combat goes, I found that it is a bit clunky by modern standards, which kind of makes sense. This game is nearly 25 years old at this point. This doesn't mean that it was wholly unenjoyable, but the auto-aim mechanic in combination with trying to orient the camera to enemies doesn't always work as intended, and the melee combat, while it does do the job, isn't the most intuitive system I've ever seen. Some of this I actually considered may have been for immersion purposes, because James isn't a Leon S. Kennedy or Chris Redfield type. He hasn't, as far as I know, been trained with firearms or other melee combat, and so it made sense to me that the combat didn't feel the best. James, like any of us other normal people, would likely run at the first sign of danger. I also think what helped the combat not feel as rough as other clunky games from this time period was that the game wasn't really centered around combat, and it wasn't all that difficult on normal difficulty. Sure, I did die a few times in my playthrough, but this game really isn't the most difficult game out there, and I think because the combat isn't super unforgiving, the clunkiness almost really never felt like a point of contention for me. We should probably talk about motion a little bit and how the movement works in the game, because like I said, most of these enemies are going to be ones you're running away from. Thankfully, the clouds opened up and the Silent Hill gods heard my pleas from the first game. Tank controls were an optional setting in Silent Hill 2, and I love that. I get it, tank controls make for more tension and yeah, blah, 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 blah. I hate tank controls. I know it's a me thing, I just don't like them. I find them extremely clumsy and frustrating in ways that do not increase my enjoyment of the more tense moments of the games that feature them. I'm also willing to admit that this is entirely a personal gripe, and some people love tank controls. It's probably a skill issue. More power to you. I was just really happy to see that this was an option that allowed for anyone to choose how they wanted to experience this game. Very cool, Team Silent. Very poggers. So yeah, that made my first experience with this game one in which I could fully focus on the narrative and characters because I wasn't really fumbling around with the movement. Aside from the combat and running around avoiding combat, the other mainstay in both Silent Hill 1 and 2 was solving puzzles to progress through the game. Here, the puzzle difficulty can actually be controlled by the player with easy, normal, and hard options just like the combat. Now, I'm usually pretty terrible at puzzles, even when the answers are embarrassingly obvious. Silent Hill 2 on normal was challenging for me, I'm not gonna lie, but it also made me realize that some of the issues I had figuring out easier puzzles in other games may just be down to me overthinking the answers. A lot of these puzzles did take a bit for me to figure out, whereas others were just remembering a sequence of numbers until I found the proper place to enter those numbers. Yeah, not gonna lie, those were still a struggle for me because my short-term memory for numbers specifically sucks. Thankfully, I could always reflect on the memos within the inventory to refresh my memory once I managed to find the door keypad or safe. Overall, the puzzles were pretty entertaining, and while some were a little bit difficult for me, overall the solutions did bring with them a sense of accomplishment, which I also experienced when gathering the items to combine to solve certain dilemmas that James encounters. And let me just tell you, some of the items that you find in this game that are the answers to puzzles are hilarious and that they feel almost surreal, like, how would someone even know to try this object in this situation? But hey, surrealism is kind of the name of the game here. And that's pretty much it for Silent Hill 2 from a gameplay standpoint. It's a simple enough gameplay loop, but in practice, there's actually a lot of nuance and challenge to it. I felt like this time around I was much more prepared for what a Silent Hill game would be, having had played the first one. And while this one was far more disturbing than the last one, the gameplay itself felt familiar enough to the point where I didn't really have issues with running out of ammo or health items by the end. Gameplay was a solid experience overall, and I had a good time slowly wading my way through the dark and disturbing world of Silent Hill 2. Like always, this section of the review will likely be quite a bit shorter than others, and especially so in this case. I always strive to not spoil games for people, even old games like this one, especially when there's a remake due, because I feel like if you want to be able to enjoy this game for the first time, you should be able to do that. So typically what I do, if you've never seen my channel, is I kind of lay out the story a little bit. I really try to avoid spoilers, and then I just talk briefly about how I feel, and then we move on. So, Silent Hill 2's story is the best part of this game in my opinion. Slowly uncovering the truth of each of the characters' stories as you spend time with them and find little bits of lore throughout the world is just done so well. It was like a breadcrumb trail that just kept providing at a fantastic pace all the way to the end. There are multiple endings that can be earned based on how you actually play the game, and I can say that the one that I received was a satisfying close to James's story. The player's unspoiled narrative experience is really at the core of what makes this game such a great game, and so please, you owe it to yourself to give this a playthrough if you have the ability to do so. Because of how integral the story is to the rest of the game and how important I think that it is that your first experience is as spoiler-free as possible, whether it be through the original or the upcoming remake in a few days, all I will say is that you should play this game if you are even slightly interested. The story is really that good. What I will say about the story and its setup is that we take on the role of James Sunderland, a guy who gets a letter from his wife who's telling him to basically meet her in their special place in the town of Silent Hill. The only issue with this is, James's wife has been dead for the last 3 years. So whether driven by his desire to see if this is really true and this could be his wife, or whether it's the town itself calling out to him, James sets out to find out the truth of these things. It's a beautifully tragic story that follows James along with other characters as they unravel what called them all to Silent Hill, and it's one that just doesn't pull any punches and was thought-provoking in the best way possible. Now, I'm not going to spoil it here, but the ending that I had for this game was so emotional that, I felt like I needed a breather after beating this game to just consider my thoughts, but it really does make you want to think about, the implications and deeper meanings and what actually happened within the story of this game and before the story takes place for us. Like the events that led up to this. It's just really, really that good, and I think that anybody that's a horror fan or likes psychological, mind-bending kind of stuff would enjoy this. Silent Hill 2 is a fantastic game that manages to compile all of its parts into a game that is deserving of its praise and legendary status. While the visuals may have aged since 2001 and some of the voice work does feel a bit stiff and awkward, the presentation otherwise is really impressive with just how much of the heavy lifting it does to make this game leagues more tense and nerve-wracking than its predecessor. While the combat does feel a bit clunky in practice, the rest of the gameplay more than makes up for it, as the combat is almost never the focus of what you're actually doing within the game. Clever puzzles and frantically running around the labyrinthine-like buildings trying every single doorknob just to get away from your pursuers makes for a thrilling experience that really knows how to make its main character feel like the average Joe. For every backstep in quality that the game may have taken due to its age, it makes up for by taking many more strides forward that lead to it feeling still very playable and refreshing even when played today. And the story is just a masterclass, thought-provoking piece on grief, guilt, and the other complex feelings that we lock away within ourselves sometimes when the trauma that we're going through has just become too much to bear. Silent Hill 2 is a fantastic game, and I'm excited from what I've heard about the remake so far for new players to get the chance to experience the story for the first time, especially if that's the only way that you really have to play this game. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. Have you played the original Silent Hill 2, or is the remake going to be your first time with the game? I would love to know your thoughts in the comments below, and until next time, Plooper Troops, peace.